When we consider the difference between literary fiction and popular fiction, it's generally assumed that the distinction is that literature and literary fiction includes heavier themes, more complex language, and more complicated structures. And the idea being that literary fiction is, in character, more difficult. So then it should come as no surprise that many great works of literature are actually really difficult reads. So that begs the question which I want to tackle today, which is, at what point does the difficulty of a book outweigh any potential value that it holds? And I can think of no better example to use than the masterclass of high European modernism, which is Hermann Broch's The Death of Virgil. For context, Broch is not known as an easy read at the best of times. He sits very comfortably in the middle of that school of mid-20th century European writers, whose books were very long and complicated and covered themes like studies of the human character. For a similar writer, look no further than someone like Thomas Mann or even the poet Rilke. Like The Death of Virgil, Broch's other books are long, and yes, they are a little bit difficult, but with this book in particular, he tried to push the envelope of what is possible with a novel. Based on the success of his trilogy called The Sleepwalkers, Broch was already a fairly well-respected author when The Death of Virgil was first published. It was actually translated into English before publication, and the German and English versions were released at the same time in 1945, both expected to be a resounding victory for his publishers. The German editions sold out immediately. The English translation, however, took the better part of the next 20 years to sell their first run. For the most part, that does have to do with his popularity in Germany, but it also has quite a bit to do with the complexity of the novel itself. In terms of plot, The Death of Virgil is quite literally about the death of the poet Virgil, author of the Aeneid. It covers the last day in his life and is broken into 4 sections. The first is straightforward and covers his arrival at Brundisium and his observations of the citizens that he passes. He is old and sick at this point in his life and knows that death is near. In the second section, the feverish and suffering poet decides that the Aeneid is meaningless and must be burned. In the third section, he has a long conversation with Emperor Augustus throughout the night and is finally persuaded to not burn the manuscript. And in the fourth section, as Virgil dies, we witness him voyaging through an endless sea as the earth and all of history unfolds and reverses before him, and existence itself eventually disintegrates into the Word of God. I can't be clear enough when I say this. That fourth section is some of, if not the best writing I've ever read in any book by any author. I read it maybe 10, 15 years ago, and it's something I think about all the time. I remember literally where I was sitting when I read it. It meant a hell of a lot to me at the time, and it made everything that came before it worth it. Because I also cannot be clear enough when I say that the second section of the book is probably the most difficult and complicated writing I've ever read. It sounds simple enough on the surface. Virgil decides that he must burn the Aeneid, but it is actually about 150 pages long, and it is written in an incredibly dense, cyclical call and response style, somewhere halfway between a philosophy text and poetry. The rest of the book may not be too difficult, especially compared to that, but it is this second section of the book that usually turns most readers away from it. I'll leave an example of the writing on screen right now, so if you are interested, pause the video and give it a crack. And then remember, once you've read this, that there are 150 of these. It's certainly not the sort of thing that many people read for fun or would enjoy reading. But the unfortunate fact is, those who don't get through that will never get to experience the transcendence of that final chapter. And that's a very hard thing to convince someone of if they've just read what you've read. And I'm certainly not the only one to point this out. Google any review of this book, and how difficult of a read it is will probably be the first thing mentioned. Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, after reading it, allegedly told Broch that he'd asked too much of his readers. So I suppose the question for us is, did he? In truth, I don't think so. It's not the role of art necessarily to please its audience, and I suppose that's probably what separates art and entertainment. But in challenging the audience, the writer and the artist really run the risk of alienating them. So most of the reviews that are negative about this book are from people who felt alienated by it. In all honesty, I would be absolutely shocked if a book like The Death of Virgil could get published today. There is no attempt to dumb down its subject matter for a wider readership. The language and structure in parts is almost prohibitively complicated, and what little plot there is plays second fiddle to a series of philosophical and ethical questions that it raises. And I also think that is absolutely fine. There is and there will always be a section of readers who are interested in that and get enjoyment from that sort of writing. This book, like every book ever written, has an audience. It may not be a large target audience, mind you, but it does exist. If Broch was able to get this book published, despite its complexity, and he believed enough in its message to warrant writing it the way he did, then there is no one to say that he was wrong to do it. Yes, writing something this dense will limit its readability, but provided you're not trying to be a best-selling author, I don't think a writer necessarily should hold back. In the end, art is simply about self-expression, and to restrict that seems unwise and unfair. In The Death of Virgil, Broch has created something spectacular that wouldn't sing it nearly as loud as it does if he'd tried to strip it back for a bigger audience. It is dark, and it is dense, and it is frustrating, and it's challenging, and if it wasn't for those things, it wouldn't be anywhere near as special as it is. That, of course, is just my opinion, and there are plenty of people who hated it for all the reasons that I liked it, and there's absolutely nothing to say that they are wrong. So I hope in some way I've convinced some people of the merits of this book, because there's a good chance, if you're not following the channel and you've just found this video, that you looked it up because you just got to chapter 2 and you cannot fathom what you were reading. Give it a go. That's all I would suggest, is that, at least in my case, the ends justify the means. It is a work of art, and if you treat it more like a work of art than a work of fiction, you're probably going to appreciate it for what I believe are its merits a lot more. That being said, if you have read the book, I'm genuinely interested to hear what your impressions of it are. Most of the reviews are simply about its difficulty, and it is really interesting to me what other things people take away from the novel, because it is full of insights, and that last chapter, again, is spectacular. So please let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. And if there's any other difficult novels you want somebody to come out and defend, I might be the guy, so let me know that as well. Have a good week. Thank you for watching, and I will see you later.